Body. Thank you very much for coming. Please don't close the door. I think it's the old tradition that when the event starts, people start coming. So I hope that it will work this time as well. I'm very happy to open this event, and it just crossed my mind there should have been somebody else playing the role of moderator, but I can do both. My name is Mark Lipovetsky. I'm professor at Columbia Slavic Languages, and today we are going to introduce the book that you can see on the table. Unfortunately, we don't have enough books for you. This is just the acquaintance copy, let's put it this way, copies, but well, you see, it works. But this flyer on the table, it contains a QR code that allows you to order the book with a discount. I don't know how large is this discount, but it discount nonetheless.
30%.
30%, think about it.
And it's not an expensive book, so...
Really, we already started launching. Right. I want to introduce my dear co-author, Andrew Kahn, professor of Oxford University, St. Anthony Edmunds College. Yeah, I was confused yesterday. St. Edmunds Hall College, and Andrew is the author of many exciting books on various subjects, stretching from the 18th century to contemporary short story, and I'm very happy to be his co-author along with Professor Reifman and Professor Sandler, whom I introduce in a second, as co-authors of the history of Russian literature that we published a while ago. 7 years ago, I can do it. Yeah, 18.
But the paperback has 500 corrections. So
right,
get the paperback.
Don't make people distracted. They will be confused about what book we are taking. Right. So, and in a certain way, this book is the extension of that project. So after looking at many centuries of Russian literature from the bird's eye height, we decided to practice close readings, and so that's the book. Also, we have our dear guests and friends who will be participating in this launch project. This is Stephanie Sandler, professor of Harvard University, one of the best specialists in contemporary, and not only contemporary poetry, Russian poetry specifically, and the author of the recent book, The Freest Speech in Russia, right? Dedicated specifically to contemporary Russian poetry and published by the same press as this book. And Kevin Platt, another great friend of ours and also specialist in poetry, and he also has some kind of some participation in this book as a translator. So
very minor.
Not judging by the length of the poem, it's not minor. It's pretty. Kevin translated Galina Rymbu's poem "My Vagina," so now we know whose vagina is Galina Rymbu's vagina in English, and that's good. Sorry, probably that was off. Scratch it out. Can we fix the Zoom recording? I hope we cannot. Yeah, Galina Rymbu had been on me for some time, so I couldn't hold my tongue. Sorry, I wouldn't do it again. All right, so let me say a few words about this book, although for some reason we don't have a picture. What's happened with the picture? I don't know. No picture.
Which the projector went to sleep because it's right there.
We'll see. No, you must sit.
The little panel is blinking. It's a bank of panels.
Okay.
So not. Okay, can you use the turn off projector and on? No, turn off, on, display on.
Let's do on. That will be better.
These were our systems.
Oh, no, soon we'll start them. Right, okay, so the game plan is the following. Andrew and I, we will introduce this book as briefly as possible. Then we'll give the floor to Stephanie and Kevin, and then we'll open the floor for
Where is Adam?
sorry.
Oh, maybe someone else can. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, that's maybe it's warming up.
It's on, people can look at it.
Yeah, we can see the screen here. Hello, but not there. Well, let's go back. All right, so this book carries the subtitle "Critical Anthology of Modern Russian Poetry," and this strange title because, as you understand, it's either critical or anthology. That's what is called a magic touch, right?
Yeah.
We don't have it,
No.
obviously, right? It consists, as those of you who got a hold of it, and I also will hopefully open it. Oh, no, I have something bad. The table of content as long as you can see it. I hope you can see it. So it consists of 34 chapters. Each chapter includes a poem in Russian, its translation, and then an essay dedicated to it. We were trying to make the number more attractive. We were working on 30 poems at first, then it became 33, then we couldn't sort of restrain ourselves and edit another one, and then we agreed that 34 is as good.
Actually, we had 40 in one plan.
No, yeah, 40.
We had 40 in
We
one
had
plan.
40 in the very beginning, but
Right.
then we realized that that's more than we can survive. And so that's a hybrid genre, obviously. On the one hand, it is really the anthology of Russian poetry, beginning with Blok and ending with Maria Stepanova. The earliest poem is from 2007. The latest is from not 2007, 1907. I'm sorry. The latest from 2021. Right. So Andrew will say a few words about the principles of selection, probably the most difficult question, and only an Oxford professor can answer it. But the main point here is that we were trying to include those poems that we find exciting. And some of these poems are famous, others are not so famous. The third group probably are known only to very, very specialized experts, but we like them nonetheless. I did some math, which never happens with me voluntary, and I figured out that 17% of this book is dedicated to contemporary living poets, 6 out of 34, and all of them are women, which I think speaks well about us, or about that book, right? Let's be modest. Right, Andrew, please.
Oh, well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Mark and Harriman Institute for inviting me to join you here. And it's great to be with Stephanie and Kevin and Mark and all of you. And so I was very happy to make the trip. And of course, it was great to collaborate with Mark again. I think that anyone who looks at an anthology that contains only 34 texts, I mean, all of you will be familiar with anthologies that sometimes contain hundreds of lyric poems. I mean, look at Gasparov's Seria Bereniviet anthology, which is really compendious and comprehensive. And a book like that says, this is a textbook, or this will give you the history of lyric in that period. If you look at a book containing only 34 lyrics from such a broad span, you might conclude that this is not meant to be a canonical statement. It's not meant to be used as although it, of course, has a certain historical element to it, it's not aspiring to be a history of Russian poetry for the period, because 34 texts is just too sparse and too sporadic. So the question is, how did we decide on, not so much on 34, but which texts? And as Mark said, we started with 30, then 34 or 40 or whatnot. And I think there were, there are a number of principles that were at work. First of all, I think one has to make concessions to reality. The book is long, at almost 560 pages, and we knew it would not be, well, and that was well over contracted length. And I think we thought that if we got to 40 poems, this was the original plan, we would write a book that was 700 pages long, and the press wouldn't want to sell it. That would be a problem. So there's a certain pragmatism involved. And we had that experience with OUP, where we were contracted to write a short history of Russian literature, a very short history, and we wrote this enormous book. And I was in Oxford. I had to have lunch with the editor, who said to me, after we sent the book in, we sat down and she said to me, you do know, Andrew, that this is not the book we contracted to write. At which point I lost my appetite and my heart sank. And she said, but it's very good and the readers' reports are fine, so it's all right. So anyway, so I think the question was, what kind of book did we really want to write? And Mark has already alluded to it. So I think that canon formation wasn't really part of it. What were our principles? Well, initially, I think we thought that one way of structuring the book would be thematically, and we had a set of categories which we thought represented or somehow gave categories that somehow took you to the heart of Russian poetry, Russian creativity, and they were self, history, culture, God, society and politics, poetry itself. And then we populated these categories. And we thought there would be a certain amount of cross-referencing. We populated them. And when I look back to the original list, what I find is that there are at least 21 poets, well, let's say 18 poets who are not in the final book, and 21 texts that would have given the book, that are not in the book, that would have given the book a very different feel, partly because some of them are famous Soviet poets. So Simonov, Wait for Me, Voznesensky, A Fire in the Institute of Architecture. There are poems by Nekrasov, there are poems by Krivulin, of course, Parshikov, Rivin, I know Irina, I remember particularly likes Rivin, Dombrovsky, a different text by Satunovsky, a different poem by Akhmatova, and a different poem by Galich, and so on. So, Aranzon, and even different poems. So originally we had a very, very different set, and then we moved away from the idea of categories. We thought it was better if they were sublimated. They're there, people can see connections, but it's just too determinist. It's a narrative we didn't want to impose on a vast body, because then if you say these 40 poems or 34 poems fit into these categories, that opens the question of how many other poems is the reader supposed to see this as a model for how to read Russian poetry. So I think our emphasis, I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, moved away from, let's say, poets to poems. Poems that were great to read, poems that offer really interesting aesthetic, cultural, linguistic, musical experience. That was one, I think, principle for us. The second principle, which I think is implicit, is the book is dedicated to close reading. So, and I think Mark is going to talk about how we handle context, but the book believes very much in the proposition that, poems need to be read carefully, closely, for their form, for their content, for their nuance, for their poetic language. And in this case, alongside very good translations, high quality translations, in order, this is, poems need to be opened up. And so in our selection, the process, sometimes we'd say, this is a poet we think is great, but this poem doesn't really. Dragamoshenko was somebody who became that very difficult to read closely in a way that seemed to work for the book. That was my view. So we looked very, very hard at many poets. We looked hard at, and then there were poets we felt, simply couldn't be dropped, who had to be there, and certain poems that were famous that had to be there. And then there were poems where we thought they're somewhat offbeat, maybe a poem by a famous poet like Brodsky, but the poem we chose is perhaps atypical for Brodsky, different sort of irony, different sort of humor. So I think that was one, or maybe those are two elements that contributed to the framework, were active principles. They are subjective. There's no doubt about it. But that was a right we felt we could exercise, or would assume we had the right to exercise. We didn't want to be too prescriptive or determinist, but we also didn't want to be too arbitrary or fanciful. So one, I think, important principle of the book is that we avoided conformist poetry. We avoided poetry that was tied to some particular ideology, or Soviet or communist or Marxist ideology, and or nationalist. And so we skirted around civic poetry, although a poem like, maybe the Galich poem is certainly in a way an anti-Soviet poem, but we concentrated more on poems that were perhaps oppositional at times. So Akhmatova is a Soviet poet, and yet the poem itself is a very interesting example of a dissident statement, the poem by Galich. But then, in a positive way, we felt that one of the principles of continuity that we saw as really an important aspect of how Russian poetic lyric creativity stayed alive was the degree to which so many poets seemed to draw inspiration from modernism and the techniques of modernism. We start with Bloch. And so we make that argument in a long introduction. And the introduction, the introduction talks about the principles of selection. It also talks about, close reading, but I think it also makes a point, which maybe is a slightly polemical point, about Russian poetry studies having perhaps got stuck in ruts for a number of decades, when structuralist poetics, for instance, I'm a Mandelstam scholar, among other things. Anyone who works on Mandelstam had to contend with decades and decades of a kind of religious belief in the subtext as the only approach to Mandelstam. And I think we both felt that things have changed. Stephanie, Kevin have changed things, have introduced other methods. I think Russian poetic studies has moved on, has learned a lot from other traditions, other ways of reading, and we felt that we could apply a broader palette of methods. So, which we're both comfortable with. So I think that pretty much, we were afraid of being over-determinist, prescriptive, too categorical. There's some, implicit categories, close reading, modernism as a framework, as a generative principle in poetry. I think these are our principles of selection, complemented by an enjoyment of the texts we actually chose. And I remember we met in Oxford for one amazing 5 days, Mark and I, by which time our list was more or less consolidated, and somehow Nikanova floated to the surface. And we just had this wonderful kind of session riffing on a number of Nikanova poems, and ended up with this one, and then spent a day kind of working together on what the heck is going on here, what does it mean, even before composing a chapter. So yeah, okay, so those are my comments on principles of selection. And then I think I hand over to Mark, who's going to talk about.
I thought you touched everything that we planned.
No,
Speak about.
no.
Right.
Now you're going to talk about translations.
Of course. Thank you, Sylvan. Thank you.
According to your own plan.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
So I'm glad that Andrew mentioned Nikanova and her poem, and as you can see, we've been prepared with this as an example to show. I think that's the most challenging poem for translation, because it includes Zaun and Sasha Dugdale, who translated it. She I believe was sort of congenial to this poem. She invented her own version of this text in English without any attempts to literalize this translation. But basically, this book is as much as anthology of Russian poetry as much as it is an anthology of translations. And it's I think it's a very good moment to say thank you to the Harriman Institute, and personally to Ron Meyer, and also to, of course, Oxford, who
and
Princeton, of course, who supported our desire to introduce a whole bunch of new translations, because only a little portion of translations in this book are borrowed from existing books, existing translations. Although many texts here are famous, we commissioned new translations there, and as I said, there are some poems that were never translated before, and they are translated for this book specifically, right? And we were very lucky, and I think that basically the culture of poetic translation from Russian into English is very lucky, because there is a sort of whole regiment of absolutely fantastic poetic translators, and some of them did several texts for this book, and among them Sasha Dugdale, which I already mentioned, who was our guest last year, right? Alia Berlina, of course, Matvey Yankelevich and Eugene Ostashevsky, Ansley Morse, Boris Dralyuk, Peter Franz, Peter Daniels, and as I already said, Kevin Platt, and some other translators. We were very fond of these translators, and we tried to include the conversation about translation into the analysis of the text, looking at how this sort of nuance of the text is conveyed by the translator. At one moment, we were a little bit disorganized, but mainly we were torn between two translations of the same text. And after long back and forth, Andrew, the brave one, contacted the press and said, what if we include the other translation as well? Which, as you know, wasn't a part of the deal. And the press was so nice, they said, okay, included. So now we have two translations of Vysotsky in this book, one by Alia Berlina, another by Boris Dralyuk, and I leave it to you to decide which one is better. As I said, we love them both dearly, right? Okay, and the effect of this emphasis on translation, I would say, Berkeley is with us. Hello, dear. Is that for at least for the first time in my career, the book is being reviewed by bloggers. Apparently, there are very many blogs. Not you see, the Russian speakers are laughing when they hear blog. English speakers are not laughing, because I understand that blog can be an intelligent form of utterance. We were reviewed in the last section, right? So there are many sites dedicated to poetry, to contemporary poetry, maybe not only contemporary poetry, and we received at least 4 reviews, extended several pages, where people were seriously, deeply, and incredibly emotionally reading this book, and they were not reading our essays by and large. Let's
yes, they were.
Some of them, the better ones, right?
Don't sell yourself short.
Okay, you're optimistic.
Talk about.
I'm not. Okay, right. No, they were reading our poems as well, but mainly they were reacting to the poetry.
Yeah,
and of course they were reacting to the poetry in English, which I think tells a lot about translations. Right? Okay, the floor is yours.
right.
My interventions are shorter.
No, anyway, so I'm just going to say a word about the kinds of poems. And you'll notice, well, if you go back to the table of contents, that we have. So the kind of presupposition was that the principle was that we would analyze complete poems, not fragments. And complete poems come in different sizes and shapes, and that's an important element of the art of the lyric poem. A miniature can be just as powerful and condensed as a long poem. And Stephanie in The Free Speech in Russia has a wonderful chapter on which really demonstrates this beautifully about what a miniature can do and how elusive and condensed and powerful short poems can be. So there's Symbolist at 8 lines. We could have chosen a poem by Mikhail Yeryomin, who also is famed for writing 8-line stanzas.
But we didn't.
We didn't because I think he's a good example of a poet. He's an example of a poet, I think, who writes a whole in a system. And he's very hard, I think, to detach one poem from, well, anyway, somehow we picked this.
It's for the questions.
Right,
Let's
okay.
leave it for the
So, but then, of course, there are longer lyrics as well, and these poems are reproduced. Mandelstam's longest lyric poem, Nasze Chipakovo, is there, also with a wonderful translation. There's a long poem by Lev Losiev, Lev Rubinstein, one of his index card poems, and they're all very. Rymbu, yes, Rymbu is also a really sprawling lyric. They're all very different, and I think the difference.
And the cycle of Akhmatova.
And Akhmatova, I'm going to talk about cycles.
I'm sorry.
But no, it's all right. So, I mean, I think that all of these poems, these longer poems, are different in themselves. The Losiev poem is a kind of soliloquy, an interior monologue. The Mandelstam poem is full of Mandelstam's characteristic complexity, but it's in free verse. It's unique for him. It's the one of a kind, a one-off in his poetic oeuvre. There's a long poem, not very typical for Nabokov, but which fits very well, I think, in the modernist, as a kind of our modernist agenda. It also resonates with Khlebnikov. And in the Rubinstein, you have, a postmodernist writer exulting in his catalogue, a catalogue poem. But then, so that's the long lyric can be very inventive, but also the phenomenon of the cycle is really important. And it was too important to structure to ignore. So we have Akhmatova's late masterpiece, cycle of poems, which I think is an exemplary demonstration of a kind of structure. And it's also a meta-narrative about inspiration and tradition that fits well with other texts. An interesting example, maybe ambivalent, is Stepanova's A Little Like This, which can be treated, I think, as a separate poem or as a part of a book. And I think people are still discussing, right, because it's from Holy Winter, maybe it's possibly both. Do you read it on its own, or must it be read as part of that sequence? So that's really just on the question of what kinds of poems, how long, how short.
And there is also a cycle that was designed by us.
Yes, Prigov, the Prigov cycle.
We have Prigov's 3 poems about dishwashing. Prigov doesn't have such a cycle, and he has more poems about dishwashing. But
do you know the sign in your own kitchen here? So if you go into the kitchenette here, there's a sign that says washing dishes makes everyone 28% happier. And then there's a footnote that says this is made up, but still please wash your dishes. So you should put Prigov up there.
The Harriman read Prigov already. It shows figures, right?
Right.
Okay. So I'll talk about logical analysis, and we'll talk about the book genre, right?
Okay.
So Andrew already touched the question about the logic of analysis, and of course, so one thing that I want to add to Andrew has already said about our selections is that we learned quite, I would say, physically, that the analysis of the poem is an organic process. there are poems that you can analyze, you can close read, because you come into resonance with it. There are poems which are wonderful, but you do not come into resonance with it, and as much as you try, it doesn't work, right? And we really didn't want to write these essays with cold feet, right? We wanted. Of course, we are not great writers. We cannot be very emotional, but we wanted to feel some emotions, and we wanted to convey these emotions. And on the other hand, we didn't want to be too academic. Our sort of, and not too impressionistic. It's of course it's a thin line there, but our general convention and agreement was that the analysis of the poem shouldn't be boring. It should be somehow interesting. Right, and as Andrew mentioned, we had many different titles on the table, and some of great authors. But when we were working on this analysis, it didn't work. It didn't work. So and we had okay, sorry. This explains some inconsistencies, some obvious inconsistencies. Right, for instance, there are three famous sort of staple poets, singers, right? Akutjava, Galich, Vysotsky, or rather Galich, Akutjava, Vysotsky, right? We have Galich and Vysotsky, but we don't have Akutjava for this exact reason, not because we think that he is a bad poet, just didn't resonate, right? So in terms of principles, Andrew spoke about this, and he spoke about the attempt to go away from structuralism and from the necessarily quest for subtext. We are more believing in context rather than subtext, right? And so we were trying to maneuver our analysis between the analysis of the form and analysis of context, and we were sort of placing the text in between these categories. Although, of course, the very with the form, it's more or less clear what to talk about, what to look at, right? And here are some of our greatest students who sat through seminars where we analyzed some of these poems and were very sort of thorough about their formal aspects. And basically, I can say that some of this essay was just driven on our wonderful graduate students and their reactions, and sort of told at least me where not to go or where it is interesting or not, right? But the very issue of context turns out to be quite slippery too, and very much subjective, as we learned in the process. For instance, this little poem by Satunovsky, I think that was the first essay that I wrote, I think, or the second, so one of the early ones, and of course it intrigued me by its form. It's very colloquial speeches, if you can see it, but at the same time it is very densely organized by different devices, from enjambments, inner rhymes, broken words. It's a very masterful construction, which at the same time impresses you as what's wrong?
Nothing.
No,
I'm looking at Andrew Bromfield, who stuck his name in my translation. Never mind.
There was a dialogue of translators there. I'll show you.
He changed one word and insisted on having his name.
That's the key question. Which word?
Right. Well, we share a name, so he changed my name. That was the word. Anyway, sorry.
All right. Okay. All right. Andrew translated some other text as well, so it was not his only contribution to this book. Anyway, but here there is this sort of stammer in this text. Как сказать, обыватель, which marks this word обыватель as something sort of out of the flow of poetic speech, and I started looking into, and Satunovsky is very helpful. He gives the date of his poem, And so I started looking around this date, and I found a number of speeches by Kalinin, by Stalin, by others, where they were sort of saying that only обыватели believe that the, and it was the time of Beria Thaw, sort of.
Philistines, for those who don't have Russian.
Yeah, Philistines. Philistines are believing into sort of loosening of the proletarian grip on the enemies, and this description of this Philistines, this obыватели, was basically the description of intelligentsia, sort of hesitant, sort of following criteria other than class criteria, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, with this broad commentary, it became obvious that this is the key word, and that sort of makes the speaker himself the object of the terrorist. Basically, he says that I am the one who is the enemy. I am sort of shadowing, mirroring this poor lady whom he suspects can be anybody, right? So that was some kind of more or less traditional context. But there are other cases where the context on the one hand was sort of coming naturally, but on the other hand, I give an example. So there is a poem by Polina Borskova, children's books, and it basically depicts Harms, Vidensky, and even Vagina appears there, Khlebnikov having some kind of leisure time, more or less fantastic landscape, right? And there are obvious connections with the opera production, memoirs. It was all clear, but then when we looked at it and looked at it for a very long time, we suddenly realized that this landscape reminds a lot of Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, and we even included reproductions from the parts of this famous triptych, and it worked beautifully. I promise. But unlike Sosnovsky, we could ask Polina if she did have in mind those associations, and Polina elusively responded that she could have. She was very polite. So obviously we invented this context, but we cannot say that it's not working, right? So context can be invented as a sort of outcome of the text itself, right? And our shared theory there that there was an unconscious context, just the poet didn't realize that she was speaking about that landscape. And here comes the critic and explains to the poet what she had in mind when she was writing this poem, as Zoshenka used to say. All right, Andrew.
I'll just be very, very brief. Just to pick up on something Mark said. I mean, I think in the process of writing and working on this, there were some surprises. So the book doesn't shy away from subtext or intertext. Obviously, that's a standard critical method. And one of the things we found is that one of the principles of continuity is Pushkin. But in particular, the Prophet, Prorok, and some other political poetry by Pushkin occurred. I don't think when we chose the poems we chose, we thought, Pushkin was at all a factor, but it turned out that some of the poems we liked best and felt moved to write about had a connection to Pushkin that was important, and they are invariably poems about freedom. So freedom wasn't necessarily one of our initial categories, but it turned out, and maybe that's not so surprising given what I said earlier about politics. Finally, I just say something about the genre of the book coming full circle. I think the emphasis is on critical, maybe more than on anthology, because as an anthology, perhaps it is a cross-section, but it's really a book about 34 poems. But the methods, I hope in a way that we were able to demonstrate a set of methods that all people who want to read poetry, I mean, the book is, envisaged for a number of constituencies, a number of readership, students, graduate students, poetry lovers, That was at least the marketing pitch to Princeton. They seem to think it was plausible. We hope it'll be read by specialists, but not only specialists. I think it's a book we hope will be read by Russianists who don't read poetry, people who think of prose as their more natural. And actually, a couple of colleagues wrote to me and said, this book looks of interest to me because I never read Russian poetry because I work on Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or whatnot, my command of poetic language.
Not only on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky.
Well, actually, the person who wrote actually works only on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but there's a lot of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky.
Don't narrow down this.
No, okay. But anyway, but I think that the translations are there as more than a crutch because they are about the art of the poem and the art of the translator, but we hope they'll make the methods, the texts themselves accessible to wide readerships. And as Mark has already said, somehow the book has resonated in this part of the blogosphere that I didn't know existed. There are serious poetry magazines out there online that given it some attention. So that was good. I think that was...
Yeah, so enough of self-praise. Let's give the floor to our dear friend. Yeah.
It's a great pleasure to be here. So first of all, congratulations on this book. I began by saying it's a pleasure for me to be here, but I want to say that pleasure is something really to be associated with this book. It's a book that gave me a great deal of pleasure to read. And I really love the way that as you talked about your selection process, you were insistent on saying you were going to write about the poems that did actually speak to you. I think that particularly in creating an anthology, we might feel a sense of obligation or completeness, or we have to have this, or it will look as if we don't know about that, right? But the desire to only have material that your own pleasure in it and your own psychic investment in it can then be conveyed to your readers, plus to have these glorious translations, I think it makes for kind of the opposite of the dutiful thing, which I think we might sometimes associate with anthologies. So I have just very, very brief remarks that are sort of embedded with some questions for you to think about, and maybe others will want to talk about. But if I had to pick a single favorite attribute of this book, it would be that it has this swerve toward really difficult, challenging poems that an anthology like this, we might think, could normally avoid. So the opening poem, if you go back actually to the table of contents, maybe we don't know how to do, but it might be helpful for people. Yeah, there we go.
Practice makes it perfect.
Yeah. So if we go back to, you see that the first poem by Bloch is actually a very long and complicated poem. There are many short Bloch poems that could have been chosen as a point of departure. So it's a little bit like setting a standard, or the kind of encoding function at the beginning that Lutman taught us to look for. It sets a standard for what's to follow. In the same way, the Stepanova poem, the very last poem, even though it's a short bit, it's from a very complex text, and it reminds us how much in between things will have that quality. The Mandelstam poem, The Horseshoe Finder, na Chekhovian, is an incredibly difficult text, even for those of us who know and love Mandelstam. So the decision to do that and the decision to pose such a challenge to the translators is, I think, one of the things that really marks this anthology. So if I stay with this idea of complexity for a moment, I want to just pose a few questions. A lot, as Mark and Andrew have already said, a lot of what's in the introduction is about critical approach. It is a re-examination of the critical methods that we have for thinking about and working with Russian poetry. So I wonder, what are some of the lessons that we take away from that critical examination? I was moved to compare it to a book by my colleague in the English department, Stephanie Burt, called The Poem Is You, which is an anthology of 60 contemporary American poems. Stephanie's anthology has more poems, so 34 versus 60, and it's also a book of about the same size. Much shorter essays. Certain decisions in that. And I wonder whether the complex texts motivate the longer essays, or did the desire, because of this idea of a critical anthology, the desire to emphasize, to foreground that critical work, indeed impel you more toward the complex text? So the second question I was going to ask, in a way you've already answered, because Stephanie talks in her introduction about the surprises that she had when she was compiling it and how that was one of her pleasures. So I was going to ask you if there are any surprises, but you kind of talked a little bit about surprises. But if there are more surprises you want to share with us, since we're talking about pleasure, and that's one of life's great surprises. So a different question, which is also prompted by Stephanie's anthology, The Poem Is You. That line, The Poem Is You, is from a very playful poem by John Ashbery. And she chose that title in the same way that you chose your title, All the World on a Page, from one of your texts from the Pasternak poem. Her choice indicates the kind of back and forth with the reader, which is one of the running themes in that book. And she foregrounds the way that a lot of the texts that she writes about want to create a reader, want to tease a reader, want to engage a reader, want to put onto the reader the work of making meaning in the elusive texts that she has collected. But I think the title, All the World on a Page, actually also expresses what you want to do with those two words, world and page, the way that you've talked about already, the contexts rather than subtext. So why is that? Is that because of a difference between the two of you as scholars and Stephanie Burt? Or is it about something that's different in the traditions, different in the materials that you write about? And I suspect it's the latter, partly because of the way that you use Pushkin's Prorok, the prophet, which you just referred to a moment ago. That's a poem that's pretty much unthinkable in the US tradition. But correct me if I'm wrong. Or if this causes you to reflect a bit on some of the contrasts between the in the same time period, what was going on in US poetry or maybe UK poetry, but English language poetry. I would find that very interesting. Finally, I promised to ask a question, which I will, about what it meant for you to assemble this book during the time of war. What does it mean to direct our attention to the Russian poetic tradition at a time when the Russian language is being used in violent, indeed reprehensible ways? We work on these things for a while, so you worked on it and during a time and probably began it before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. I wonder how the war changed things as you were working. And were you to start over now, would that context, since you talk about context, make for a different book? So some things to think about.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so very much. Do you want to start or should I? All right. So probably the answer about critical methods and lessons about which methods are preferable or not, which methods are working better or working less effectively. Each of us has a different answer. But I would say that you see, for me personally, the first, not the very first book that I read, but the first book in literary studies was the book by Yefim Etkin, Разговоры о стихах. It was a popular version of his book Materia стиха, the matter of the verse, published later in the book. And that was an introduction into the sort of formal analysis of poetry and sort of, and I recommend it to everyone who wants to learn how to analyze poetry, at least to begin doing that. I cannot say that I have moved very far away from that book published by Детская Literatura in my beliefs about the potentialities of the poetic analysis. Of course, I tried everything, and I actually and the experience of teaching the course, the latest iteration of this course we did with Ron Myers, who was responsible for the translation part, taught me that eclecticism is not always a bad word. And while analyzing poems, you need to be eclectic. Of course, if you're a genius like Lotman, you can be not eclectic in analyzing different poems, but different poem requires different set of analytical tools, and basically it's incredibly not scientific. It's sort of, I would say, even sort of manifestly non-scientific. The poem dictates the tools, and that's how it is, and that's all I learned. So surprises, there were some surprises. For instance, there were many surprises, and I don't want to bore you. My greatest surprise was Akhmatulina's poem "На улице моей который год," which every Russian speaker knows thanks to Alla Pugacheva and Ironia Судьбы, where this poem is used as a sort of lyrics for the song, a very popular song. And but this poem is very dramatically redacted in this song performance, and the most important catching about предательство, betrayal, is absent in the song version. So I was sort of started looking at this poem and realized that it is about Pasternak and Pasternak affair and outcome, and Akhmatulina's involvement into this, which is absolutely not obvious when you read it and when you hear it and when you're familiar with it. That was my biggest discovery. And
I don't have that much to add about on the eclecticism is not a bad word. You can substitute or add pluralism for eclecticism, any number of words that suggest that pragmatism, that reading, that different poems require different methods if you want to produce a statement about meaning. And the statement will always be propositional, aspirational. It may not be definitive, but one is not aiming for a closed reading. One is aiming to open up using, tools of logic and plausibility and philology and historical contextualism. So I think it's good to keep one's critical faculties, tools, whatever you want to call them, to keep them, well-oiled, diverse. But I wanted to address the point Stephanie made about Stephanie Berth. So that anthology was on my desk pretty much throughout the time. And in fact, I think we mentioned it in the original proposal to Princeton. There were two books that I thought, might persuade the press to take an interest in this project. One was Stephanie Berth's book, and another was a Cambridge University Press book about modern French poetry, edited by two people, but written by a variety of, so an edited volume, variety of contributors. But the model was a poem, a translation, an analysis. And the latter model, I think, has a lot of really good things in it. I'm not an expert on French poetry, but I found it a very confusing book because it's just perhaps a little too helter-skelter as a book. Okay. The Stephanie Berth book, I thought, and I think this is to respond to Stephanie's point, I thought I can't write that way about poems because I'm not trained to write that way about poems. It's the critic first, the voice of the critic. It's the new critic who is engaged in the contemporary poetry scene in a way that it just doesn't work for me, and I think it comes out of a tradition in Anglo-American literature. You can go to Houseman's famous lecture at Cambridge in the 1930s, where he talks about the critic as genius. You can look at someone like Christopher Ricks, or go back to I.A. Richards. You can even look at someone like Helen Wendler in the same department as Stephanie Burt, who I think believes that the voice of the critic, the style of the critic, has an authority that's equivalent to the voice of the poet and the stature of the poem. And maybe that's right, a kind of eloquence as a critic. But my own disposition is to use the methods I was taught as a philologist, that come out of structuralism, that come out of new criticism, that come out of historicism and new historicism, and to try to understand poems that way, rather than, I'm not saying that Stephanie Burt approaches these texts and this is how I feel, but it comes close to that.
That's a really, can I just quickly say,
Yeah.
that's such an interesting response. Stephanie's a poet as
Yeah,
well
yeah.
as being, and writes scholarly books,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
book on
yeah.
Randall Jordan.
Oh, yeah.
So there, she has that voice.
Yeah.
But I hadn't thought about that. I think that's a really interesting way to see that book, that
So
voice can carry through, and it also can allow you to be deft and fast.
yes, fast,
So-
very fast.
2 or 3 pages on a poem, rather than 15 or 20, which have that kind of scholarly.
Well, we
depth.
do have shorter chapters, but you're absolutely, I mean, I read the book, I thought it was exhilarating.
Yeah.
I've read it with admiration. I learned a lot. I learned about Chicano poetry. I learned about all sorts of things, but I just thought, this isn't what we do
Or can do.
or can do.
Just a moment, Bill. We'll finish answering the questions. Stephanie raised this incredibly, am I interrupting you?
No, not at all.
Important question about writing in the time of the war.
Mm.
And indeed, we started this book before the full-scale invasion, and
But after 2014.
but
so
after
well
2000,
after 2014.
well after 2014. And we both are aware, and I personally support the idea and the need for critical revisions of Russian cultural canon in the light of issues of nationalism, imperialism, first and foremost. But on the other hand, I think that this book is timely in its own way, because as much as the revision is necessary and important, it's also important to remind that Russian literature, Russian culture, we may say, cannot be reduced to imperialism, nationalism only, and that not everything is infected by nationalism and imperialism, and that there are other aspects of this culture that are worth your interest and attention and excitement and everything else. Would we do this book differently if we started it after February 22? I don't know. I don't see in this book any poem that I'm ashamed of for selecting. Maybe I'm completely wrong, and colleagues will say that shouldn't be there. But we sort of tried and fully aware that the poets could have said different things and could have acted differently, but the poems that we have, they're about different things and different aspects of Russian culture, which, as I said,
But I mean, the poem by Gore, for instance, which is quite a remarkable poem, could speak for any atrocity, any moment of terror, any moment of war. And I was reading Oksana Maximchuk's book, Still City, and thought of Gore. So it's remarkable that poetry can be, a poem like this can have been written out of the siege, out of a moment of cannibalism, nightmare. So I I mean, the question itself is a kind of counterfactual question. I have to think about it, but I subscribe to what Mark has said. I think there are poems that show great humanity that would still be appropriate now.
I think we need to give the floor to
Yes, Kevin.
Kevin Platt
You want to like have some follow-up questions from the,
after you.
okay.
So first the pre-programmed questions, after that improvised.
Can we put up my little slide?
Yeah, sure. Because
It'll give people something to look at if they're bored with all these words. I think it might be, yeah, in a different, there it is. Can we look at like fuller screen because there's all that little tiny text.
I'll try.
There we go.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. I made this while I was toying with this book just to pass the time. I think it's fairly interesting. And if you're bored by what I'm saying, you can study it.
You can come close.
Yeah. So it's just all of the poems by date in the anthology. So first of all, as Stephanie said, congratulations. A book launch is such a great thing always. And this is a special launch for all of us who are concerned with teaching and writing about Russian poetry in the Anglophone world. Stephanie blurbed this book, I blurbed this book. My blurb says it's a gift to students, scholars, and the broader public. I stand by that. It's certainly true. Hurrah.
Thank you.
So All the World on a Page presents important poems in superb translations, some of them brand new, as we have heard. And beyond the poetry itself, as we've heard, Mark's and Andrew's interpretive essays carefully combine in this wonderfully eclectic way, biographical and historical context with general accounts of the poetics of the individual poets, their fit within literary and poetic tradition, and very attentive close reading. They combine the best of critical work of multiple schools of criticism with the insights and creativity of two superb scholars at the top of their game. And they managed to do all that without being weighed down, which is a real feat. They're not scholarly essays. They're very light and wonderful to read. It's a real feat, and I congratulate you on that. I hate anthologies. I'm putting one together, and I really like this one. It's like all these dirty secrets of poetry readers. I also, when I pick up a book of poetry, I like very often never get through all of it. Like I find the poems in it that really speak to me, and I just read those ones over and over again and memorize them and inflict them on my friends. But then like the half of the book, I've got this beautiful volume of Larkin, remember they did all that Larkin stuff, and there's some like incredible poems in there, and I haven't read like 90% of the book. So it's, but this is a book which you want to read every poem. You've selected all these great poems, not too many of them, with these great essays. It's an incredible thing, as opposed to having like this silver, what is the?
I studied the movie.
Yeah, it's like, it's how many poems are in that thing? It's really daunting and horrible. Yeah, sorry. I'm revealing all of my weaknesses as a scholar of poetry. Lack of comprehensivity. Sticking with the blurbs on the Just Jacket, there's a little bit of a tension between my blurb and that of Lyuba Goldberg. I write that, quote, the book decisively revises and updates representation of the Russian poetic canon for the present moment. And Lyuba writes, it's very complimentary, but she has this word in there. It says, the book offers, quote, a compelling version of the canon while daring to represent it through an idiosyncratic selection of texts, which fascinates at every turn. But she praises you to the skies, but of course. So how are we actually going? So I want to get back to selection principles of the book. Are they idiosyncratic? Are they presenting some kind of canon? Mark and Andrew have already addressed this a bit in their comments. I want to think about it a little bit more. Of course, I would never nitpick about individual poems or quotes included or left out. In some sense, a book like this can be both highly personal and authoritative in the image it presents of Russian poetry of the 20th and 21st centuries. The collection is a reflection of what Mark and Andrew personally consider to be important for us all. And we're well past an era in which scholars could sit around a little table like this one and debate the relative degrees of greatness of one or another poem or poet. Furthermore, as I think we've already heard, one of the great accomplishments of this book is that it brings to the fore texts and authors that other preceding projects have not privileged to this degree, poets and texts that scholars and poets have recognized as important, to be sure, but which have not been promoted as the face of Russian poetry in an anthology for English readers. So Gennady Gor and Nikonova, for instance, or as Stephanie pointed out, the block poem, like we don't have another anthology with Neznakomka or Dvinatset or something. We have Wolnie Мысли о смерти. So Mark and Andrew make these poets and texts available to readers who would never otherwise have encountered them, and explain to them why they're exciting and important pieces of writing. Nevertheless, it should be recognized that this book is not simply a compendium of fascinating and important texts, but a whole assemblage. It does tell a unified story, despite Andrew's protestations that it's not a literary history. On the cover, it tells us it's an anthology, a critical anthology of modern Russian poetry. It's like claiming some territory there. So I want to know, what is the unified story that this book tells? At one time in my life, I was fascinated by the problem of the lyric poem and history. Lyric poems gravitate, of course, towards smaller chunks of time than we usually associate with the term history. Often they tell of moments rather than chains of events, although they can also present narrative, and a number of the poems in this anthology do so. Anyway, when I was thinking about lyric and history, I came up with a structuring device for thinking about lyric poetry and history in a book that I still may or may not ever write. And that was the metaphor of string theory from physics. My idea was that human time should not be thought of as a singular, dimension, runs from past, present to future, but might better be thought of as extending along multiple different temporal dimensions, which are all bound together in the present at varying scales in this multidimensional temporal object. With different properties at different scales. That's how string theory works, right? There's certain kinds of properties of matter which can only be seen at these tiny little dimensional scales that we don't have any experience of because we're humans and we live in only 4 dimensions. So lyric time persists as this small scale dimension of human experience, yet one with its own temporality, but one that should be recognized on a par with large scale dimensions of historical narrative as it's usually conceived, and that enters into contact with it and challenges it or transforms it. And I think that's how this book works, the one that we have in front of us, in terms of an account of literary history. Here's another way to think about that same problem. I brought Show and Tell too, not this book, but and it's not the poem that but I never get a chance to share this, so I thought I would send them around. But I think it has something in common with this book. So Mark and Andrew, in their excellent essay on Lev Rubinstein's index card poem, "Это я," that's me, they explain how the poet takes a stream of heterogeneous linguistic, discursive, and stylistic forms, quotations, and pseudo-quotations. I don't know if any of these poems count as pseudo-quotations. They might. Maybe it's Stanovsky. Yet fortuitous interactions between the fragments confer on them a new coloration and a new meaning. The poetics of the anthology, of any historically extended anthology of lyric poems, actually works in a similar fashion. All the World on the Page is a literary history that tells the story of 20th and 21st century Russian poetry as a whole. It achieves its effects through accumulation of the minor dimensional lyric moments of these poems, buttressed by biographical and literary historical vignettes offered by the essays. The kaleidoscopic account presented in the interaction and combination of these fragments confers on them new meanings, or as Mark and Andrew refine their formula with regard to Rubinstein's text, transforms them into an entirely untrammeled resource for generating new meanings, which I think is what this anthology does. I'm not going to offer any more of a synthetic account of the resulting representation or multiple possible representations of literary history offered in All the World on a Page. But my question to you guys was going to be all along, what do you consider to be the guiding concept of the account of the whole, as opposed to the parts, which we have talked about? And how did that concept change in the course of the writing? How is your concept of literary history transformed by this project? Yet I will offer a couple of observations that might help to see some of the more general features of the historical conceptions of the book, to see it in silhouette. And first of all, I made this infographic, which shows the dates of the poems addressed in the book. And clearly the dates alone tell a story about the contour of literary history as an extraordinary flowering of poetry at the start of the century, focused in the 1920s, and in particular on 1922, where there are 3 poems stacked on top of one another. Other accounts of the same literary history might have started a little bit earlier and been thinking about the Silver Age as the point of origin, or 1912 perhaps. You have this new surge of activity in the 1960s, which tracks with other accounts of literary history, Russian poetic history, of course, followed by this ultimate new upswing beginning in the 1980s. 1985 turns into another one of these dates with a bunch of poems stacked up across it. Other accounts might have made this last period denser, I think, given the enormous flowering of poetry in the new century. And that's one thing, which is like, it really is more a 20th century anthology with a kind of an epilogue of 21st century poetry. Anyway, these dates are a rough and approximate way of grasping something about how time is represented in this anthology. After I came up with this one, as I was on the subway up here, I was thinking I should have done another infographic with the birth dates of the poets, because actually the clumping gets even more intense, I think, if it's the birth dates. And we're just thinking about poetic generations, because there are like uncharacteristically late poems of a number of these, like Akhmatova is chosen from much later, or Brodsky from the 1990s. So we would have had, I think, even more clumping if there had been, they're just like whole poetic generations which are missing. Or I mean, maybe they're not missing, not needed, perhaps, for this account. Anyway, I wanted to end by talking about space. I wish I had time and ingenuity to map out some kind of equivalent graphic representation of the spatial dimensions of this anthology. I'll note briefly that this is a book that is interested primarily in poets whose biographies are bound up closely with politics centered on St. Petersburg and Moscow. The Russian Empire, the USSR, the Russian Federation, some poets of the imperial and Soviet eras whose careers and lives led into emigration are represented in the book. Khadasevich and Brodsky, for instance, but they are exceptional in the book. And in the post-Soviet period, the picture is slightly different. It still revolves around Russia. The poets of the 21st century were treated in the book. Galina Rymbu, Fanailova, Stepanova all began as central poets within the Russian Federation. They have all now left. And there's no knowing whether they will ever return, or perhaps no chance that this will come to pass in some cases. It might also be pointed out that although the anthology is clear in its orientation towards poets who were not aligned, and we've already heard this, not aligned with the Soviet state in its most awful forms and at the height of the socialist realist aesthetic in the middle of the 20th century, it nevertheless, even in telling the story of poets on the right side of history, but the wrong side of their country politics, as the jacket bird tells us, it remains a story of poetry in the shadow of the series of Russian, Soviet, and Russian states. Poets of the diasporas, the beached diasporas, who are hard to inscribe into a story about those politics, but nevertheless are important poets. I'm thinking about people like Shamshad Abdullayev, who intentionally in his poetics kind of looks over the Russia at other places. From Uzbekistan, the Arbita poets from Latvia, Galina Rymbu and Schwab from Israel are not represented here. This is not their story, in other words. And the tradition presented here remains, for all the oppositional or at least non-conformist stance of many of the poets represented, really a story about poetry in the shadow of Russian statehood. I'm hesitant to interpret this snapshot of the geographical shape of the book too strenuously, but I'm curious to hear from the authors their interpretation of the fates of Russian poetry in the present and future. If this book presents up to the recent past a story about poetry that happens in Russia or the USSR, what does it mean that the poets of the present are no longer present in that geography? Is the story of poetry in Russia over, or will it rise again from the ashes? What of those other Russian poetic cultures that cut ties with the Russian Federation more completely? And is that where these people are bound? And then how did they relate to those other earlier islands of Russian poetic culture? And of course, a different selection of present poets might have told a different tale too. There are interesting oppositional nonconformist poets who are still in the Russian Federation, like Evgenia Suslova or Alexander Skidan. Yeah, so there are different ways to do it. Anyway, those are my comments on this really brilliant, wonderful volume that is such a pleasure to read, and it will be such a pleasure to use it in teaching as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kevin. Thank you. So I think that our remarks should be very short in this case, and we should open the floor for your questions. You've been listening for a long time. So I personally, of course, Kevin is right that there are very significant emissions, and that probably indeed the story about the Russian Soviet state is at the center of this collection that we compiled. Although we didn't intend it this way, but that's how it works, right? And absolutely, it could be a different collection, different story, and I wish this book would inspire colleagues to do alternative anthology, right? But your timeline is quite amazing for my eye, because not because there are clustering that I sort of am aware of, but because there are such gaps.
Yeah.
Gaps that what puzzle me. Okay, I can understand the gap in the 50s, although there are questions about it, and there's probably some problems with our optics that doesn't allow. We have a slide. Doesn't allow us to see something that was happening. Maybe we should look closer at the poetry of the second wave of migration at that moment, poetry of figures that are sort of were not in our purview, such as, for instance, Georgy Balduyev or somebody else, right? But the almost complete absence of the 70s, that's what puzzled me, because I cannot understand how and why it happened. But since we were operating by the intuition, by selecting poems that we liked, maybe there is something about it, and that's there is some gap of our perception, or the gap in the poetry that appears at a certain time and that appeals to us. But on the other hand, what this model shows is, and what the main question that Kevin asked about, so the magisterial plot, so to speak, right, of this collection, if it tells anything at all. That first of all, the poetry is intensive and intense, both at the time of catastrophes and their aftermaths, right? And so the 20th, the 30th, 40th, right? The what else? Between the thaw, of course, the 80s, which many of us, and I remember the early 80s as a dead time. It was the most boring time in my life, but not only in my life, it was, but apparently it was not so boring. It was very productive. So the poetry doesn't choose the time of the best sort of climate, right? It grows anyway. Another thing that we learned belatedly when we start to look at our composition, we realized with some surprise that it begins with death and ends with death. It begins with Bloch's poem about the death, which is, of course, in fact, very optimistic. Sort of after looking at several episodes of death, he sort of claims that everything will be all right. And then we have Stepanova's poem, which is not exactly about death. It's a poem inspired by COVID, but basically the entire world dies there quietly, right? Sort of according to Eliot, exactly. But I think that this framing is optimistic too, because yes, indeed, the poetry sort of registers the moments of historical death, the moments of apocalypses that happens with us, happens quite regularly at different scale. It may be purely symbolic, it may be very, very physical, but it is not the final situation. That's probably the main historical narrative that we can extract from it. I'm sorry, yes.
Jump in to say that I think, in fact, it's an effect of there only being one poem per poet. The 1970s, that's Brodsky's most productive period. And the fact that you choose a later Brodsky poem or Rymnikova,
Yeah.
1970s is some of her
Yes,
most
exactly.
work. So there's something in this which is quite fluky, and that why your idea that let's look at the dates of
Birthdays.
birth or whatever, it might give you a slightly different snapshot because in terms of the people that are chosen, you actually do. I mean, Rubinstein, Krygov, with the 70s, these people,
Yeah.
their work is emerging.
But as just to add, I'm looking at one of our versions of the selections, which I referred to earlier. And here I see actually that we could have populated every decade, and you would have had an index effect. So, for instance, we have Nekrasov's Kto jest kto from the 1950s. We have poems from the 60s. We have a number of poems from the 1970s as well. And I think we have Galich's about how Klim Petrovich made a speech at the meeting defending peace, which was in 1970. Akhmatova, Rimska Imperia, Perioda Upadka, which is a poem that appears in Jerry Smith's anthology. And I think that's one answer about, in part, that Jerry was my supervisor. I remember, it's a very, very complete anthology of. It's a very complete snapshot of a certain period in Soviet poetry, including a lot of Slutsky, and we had other principles that just dominated for us. So, and I think rather than say we have to populate every, decade, that would have been, we are writing history of Russian poetry. And since we decided we were not, or if we were, it was of a very different kind. But it's very interesting. And so people who think that there should be an anthology of this kind for the 1970s, or poets born in the 1970s, which would include Maria Stepanova, for instance, just a lot of people, Polina Barskova, go for it. I mean, go for it. But but also one other thing, which is that when we worked, the four of us worked on the history of Russian literature, and one of the things I watched, because I was less involved in part 5, which is this massive account of the modern, but I did write a bit of that. But one of the things we had to contend with and think about was dislocation, physical dislocation. Okay, so emigre poets, but also the whole problem of temporal dislocation, poems that are written in one period and then appear 50 years later, the effect of censorship, and what does that do to literary history? And do you have two contexts that you need to account for? Do you have one context for reception? Complicated issues. So I think there's always a moving, sort of greatness is lumpily distributed. We went more for greatness interest, but then the historical account will be more consecutive and more complete.
Well, in reading it, actually, the history, I mean, back to the string theory thing, it's like you have a number of historical poems, and then in some of the accounts, when you're accounting for the textual history of many of these poems, we get several different versions of the 20th century told from the perspective of several different texts. So that there is this kind of like the kaleidoscopic account of the whole.
But I'd like to thank you both for fantastically interesting, thoughtful comments, because
very kind.
No, because it's very, very good to sort of reconceptualize what one has conceptualized, or think about, gosh, it's just very helpful to have those perspectives, and beautifully articulated as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I will give the floor.
Two of my favorite poets aren't there.
Oh dear.
And I'm wondering what happened to poor Yesenin. And why don't you have Rishi?
I have the answer to both. I hate them personally. That was me. I hate Yesenin because Yesenin was all over the place when I was growing up. And I hate Rizhin because I'm from the same city as he is. And I think that he is a xenophobic, horrible person. And using and his poems are deeply xenophobic. Мы мочим чурок, it's his line. And I didn't want to have anything to do with this poet. Sorry.
And I had no say in the matter. I just had to go along for the sake of. No, but actually, I wasn't a great advocate. I mean, you've seen there, is the matter of personal taste goes into it. Oh, so wait. So Gundelsman, what's the не пора ли сменить пластинку?
No, это Гандлевский.
Oh, Gandlevsky and Gundelsman. Oh,
It's something with Гандлевский too.
yeah. I mean, both of them, they were on the short list and then just didn't.
On the long list.
On the long list, and didn't make it.
They did.
And they here Gandlevsky and Gundelsman, and then who was the third poet? Tsvetkov. So Tsvetkov, I tried very hard. I like Tsvetkov. First of all, Tsvetkov, it was going to be his poem about photography, which I love, about developing. Here it is, wiping a face overgrown by the rippling of Padroshia Rябью морщин убирать лицо. And I liked Tsvetkov enormously, and he got really, really drunk when he came to Oxford, and that was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun, and then but it just unfortunately we couldn't fit everything in, so that's what happened.
And Eremenko I love, and actually I have the essay about it written and sort of sitting. Didn't fit in.
But it seems to me it's a dead end to say why not this one, because the answer is always going to be apart from Rigi and Yesenin, the answer is always going to be if only we could have done more. I think that's always the answer.
No, but you see, so sort of we preemptively answered these questions. So some of them did resonate, some of them didn't. The question about Eremenko, as I said, I have my favorite poem by Eremenko, and once upon a time, way before this book was written, I wrote an essay about it in the very genre of this poem. But then the book has its own dynamics, and so we started looking at this thing, and Andrew said, Andrew said, and I know how polite he is, because otherwise he would say, oh, how wonderful. And if he said, I couldn't overstep this.
Who you included, but who you just mentioned, and Eremenko did not even mention.
You see, we were struggling.
Just asking.
No, I can expand. We were struggling about this entire circle of metaphoriste, right? And we were looking at Eremenko, we were looking at Parshikov, we were looking at Zhdanov. But no, Parshikov is not there, Zhdanov is not there. Actually, none from this group is there.
So Parshikov, I'm very personally fond of Parshikov. Again, he came to Oxford, and he was at some really, really wonderful dinner. And he did get drunk, and he created such a scandal in front of 400 people. It was magnificent. And in fact, I mean, we had a poem about an earthquake. I really, really wanted to write about it. So it was my personal loss that I couldn't. So,
and I tried to write about Jabu, and also it didn't fly. Just didn't fly. Sorry, Marina was.
I know you're afraid of my question.
I'm
not going to ask about myself, no. I'm going to ask about Nina Iskrenko, of course, but before that, I want to say that this canonical is very interesting term, because is canonical the best? Is the best canonical? And so when I read I'm going to buy the book.
We'll have it.
But I really would like to ask you about Nina Iskrenko, because it pains me that she's not there.
I'm sorry, Marina.
Right, everything.
No, but this is not everything.
No,
In this country, not everything.
I cannot answer this question. It pains you, but it doesn't pain me. Owen. So that's how it hurts. Right.
So beyond all the
Choices.
choices,
Right.
like should be included, you shouldn't be included. You guys had spoken about like resonances that you both had felt with these texts. And I recently, I think just a couple hours ago, they had a talk in the department also about like religiosity related to like national security in Russia and how it's related to Ukraine today. And Russia has very like rich spiritual and religious history there. So I was kind of curious to see what type of resonances did you guys see beyond just the development of the Russian state and the Soviet era, but also delving into kind of like the Silver Age and how it's developing there into Russia in terms of mystical, spiritual, religious resonances. Could you speak more to that if possible?
So first of all, I want to clarify that what I said about state was responding to Kevin's observation, and it's sort of it's like Bosch in Barskov. It was completely unconscious. We didn't want to build this anthology around interactions with the state. That was not our issue. As for the religious motives, there. For instance, we have chosen from Harms the text, the poem in prose, basically, which is called Mir, which is one of his most, I'd say, convoluted poems about religion. Vidensky's poem "Гость на коне" is also a religious poem, very religious. It's about God, right? How God sort of shows his face to the world. And so we are talking about religious experiences in the way
Mayakovsky, Yubilin, addresses God.
No, not
directly.
listen, послушайте. Врывается к Богу.
Okay,
Of course, right.
He's quoting the Pope, not
So no, these motifs are present, and they're not just the motifs of sort of religiosity in the terms of the institution. It's in the terms of spiritual. Yeah, in the Kuzmin's poem,
which is really the most directly addresses the problem of orthodoxy in an atheist state, and envisages the Bogorodice leaving behind.
I can even also
a moment of apostasy where God. Yeah, go ahead. No. So I think it is there.
I was curious, like beyond that it's in there. Kind of you guys connection or resonances with that. I was like more like, could you speak more to that just beyond the fact that like it's in the text, kind of your connections with that, the development with kind of this string theory, like spaces, geography type stuff.
Again, we were not paying. I'm so sorry. Expression work here. No. Sorry.
I had a conversation with Maria Stepanova not long ago, and I said to her, people will say to us, you didn't include this, you didn't include that. No, you didn't. No, Maria Stepanova didn't. I said, what do I say to them? And do you know what she said? This is cowardly of me to ventriloquize it through Maria. And she said, tell them to do their own book.
Yeah, but that's so sorry, you asked about locations and spaces and geography, right? But no, we were not sort of intentionally looking at the sort of so that poets would represent different areas of Russia or empire. But our main geographical issue was not to forget about first immigration, right? And I think that immigration is represented, maybe not as much as it should be or could be, but it is represented there. And second, it's not a location; it's a symbolic location, underground. So the immigration and underground are represented in this book more than other sort of spaces, so to speak, right? But unfortunately, the general, and that's sort of both feature and a bug, so to speak. Russian culture is Moscow and Petersburg centric. That's how it develops. And so many poets that were mentioned around this table as those that we omitted, but many poets that are here, they were born and raised far away from Moscow or Leningrad or Petersburg, but then they followed the reputation of these cities, and that's where they realize them.
Could I say, I mean, I think there are lots of different spaces evoked and landscapes in the poems themselves. So, I mean, Kevin's observation was about the geography of where poetry happens, kind of literaturna carta. But I mean, you know, if you look at space in Widzienski, Mir by Harms, this is about the kind of space as a, I don't know, metaphysical space. Space is in a kind of categorical Kantian sense. You look at Holin, the slums of communism. You look at, you know, the Leningrad siege in Gord.
Zabolotsky,
and Zabolotsky, Magadan. So there are all different institutions, different historical moments, different spaces. And they're not all cosmopolitan or urban or even civilized. And I think they're in the poems.
Or even geographical.
Or even geographical. They're somehow, that's right, in a different dimension, a different zone. So I think the book acknowledges, or rather has a fair number of poems in which poets, and Tsvetaeva as well. It's about love as a way of transcending space and time altogether. So I think even a selection of poets who are mainly from, you know, Moscow and Petersburg are looking to different have conceptualized space in very different ways.
Yeah.
Represented.
Thank you so much for this interesting discussion. You mentioned that you didn't take Dragomoshenko into the anthology because it was not very suitable for the close reading method.
No, we didn't say that.
No,
we struggled. There were two poems, there were Politiku and Ludwig. And somehow, I think as Mark said, sometimes it just didn't click. It just didn't, he is suitable for close reading.
Personal then. What do you think?
Yes,
we talk about him in the introduction, how much we would like to have had a reading of Dragomoshenko, and somehow it didn't work. Yeah.
No, the Dragomoshenko, we certainly recognize that he's an important poet.
And also there are other poets who, you know, are important phenomenologists who are thoughtful about language in a way that's compatible with Dragomoshenko. They're not Dragomoshenko, but at least I think we consoled ourselves in saying that some of those elements are here, but elsewhere. But no, he's very important. In fact, I was just saying to Stephanie this afternoon, trying to remember that I remembered that I corresponded with Lynn Haginian in Berkeley about commissioning a translation of Dragomoshenko. So we got pretty far down the line, and somehow just.
I didn't want to accuse you of.
Please go ahead. I'll just remember that.
Looking at the poem, for example, from Khlebnikov, this is not for visual experimental, right? Poems. From Khlebnikov, it's also not Bogoyovi or other more like linguistically experimental poems. So I was wondering if this did not just align with this method that you chose and with the paradigm that you, or if this was just, I don't know, a coincidence.
No, it's not a coincidence. You're absolutely right. So I would say that there are two reasons for this. First of all, the question of translation. As you certainly understand, Zaun is hard to translate, and still we use Nikonova, which is her probably the least заумное стихотворение from whatever she wrote in her long career, at least in my knowledge, right? And still it was very short. So Zaun, we wanted the poem to be sound in translation, and it is hard to imagine how to do that. Secondly, that's probably, you are right, and the same goes to Dragomoshenko. Our method has its limits, and we are aware of that. We are maybe not aware of, we didn't formulate our limits sort of rationally when we started, but there are things that we can analyze, there are things that we cannot analyze. languages. And we realized it sort of when we were trying to do that. With Rogomoshenko, I should admit that I tried and I failed. I understood that it can turn into some kind of flat commentary to some connections with real circumstances and persons, which is below Rogomoshenko, who is much more complicated, or it should go into some kind of metaphysical constructions which I cannot produce because it's not the language I speak. Right. The same with the visual poetry. You have to develop the language for the analysis of the visual poetry. I don't have it, and I don't know if Andrew has it. He'd never admit it.
I just to say something about Khlebnikov. I mean, Khlebnikov's sort of neologisms, his verbal genius and differentiation is most on display in his long poems, right? And you know, Vladimir Markov, of course, wrote a whole book, and Von Brunn has had made amazing contributions on that subject. So, and there's a Khlebnikov who's sort of forgotten, which is the Khlebnikov who's intelligible. It seems to me everyone, it seems to me it's commonplace now to think of Khlebnikov as only a Zaum poet who can't be understood. And I think that is a critical distortion. And so I read lots of Khlebnikov and the shorter lyrics. I thought this was a wonderful poem. Kevin talked about lyric and history, and I thought this did both. This did both of sort of being inventive, being historical, being prophetic, kind of being true to fitting into the book very, very well, but also showing a kind of verbal inventiveness formally. It's interesting. But you can, I think, produce a reading that suggests how thoughtful he is about history before he moves on to systematizing in a new way. So, and I thought it made a good, well, I think we both thought it also worked very well with Nashetchi Podkovu in terms of two poems that look at a moment of, cataclysm and wonder what the future will look like. But we do refer to Khlebnikov as that other poet as well. So it's the best we could do.
Universe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this. I was just wondering, maybe this is like an extension of, I think, something that has Platt said before about the way you close the anthology and you end pretty decisively with poet writing and writing that, as we now notice, like all of those contemporary authors are those who are not in Russia anymore. So the question would be, like, to echo what was being said, is it in a way like your intentional or not so much intentional like closing of like Russian modernist and like following modernism project that is now being like closed? But what I see in the choice of end with COVID and let's say not full-scale invasion is in a way like more hopeful thing, right? Because there is some, I don't know, like biological vital hope that like pandemic can be overcome. And I think like it's much easier to overcome pandemic as the ending page than like the start of genocidal war or like escalation. I was just thinking like even with the choice of Rymbu's poem, that's unaccidental that you chose My Vagina and not Velika Ruska Censura, even though you quoted like extensively. So it's hard to go around that. Because in a way that like that is in itself a very threatening poem because it ends with rather reflecting on her position in Russian literature by saying, first of all, there is no Russian literature, there is Russian language literature, and there is literature that does not belong to this like label. So I was just wondering about like working around that maybe, and like what does like the word Russian itself, not like of Russia in Russian language.
So thank you for the question. So first of all, I think that it's not in our power to sort of to close or to end Russian, not only Russophone modernism. So it's not what we can do or even aspire to do. But we both think, I guess, that in in 22, some new era of history began. Of course, it was prepared before it, and it's not came out of the blue, but it is a different history, and it is indeed a different literature, and it's so in a certain way, this era that begins with the Silver Age is over. It's ended, right? I cannot say that it's the era of Russian modernism, or but something is over, and I think we all are aware of that, and something very different begins after that, right? And it felt right to end it with Stepanova's poem, and not with one of the poems that some brilliant poems that were reacting to the full scale invasion. It would be artificial, and it would be sort of trying to extend it beyond. The story is told, right? So okay, yeah, I'm sorry.
No, not, I don't know whether this is an answer or an evasion, but I mean, I think we say in the essay about Stepanova that, you know, the word COVID also contains Ovid. And the poem is about poets and exile and what happens in a closed society. And I think if you work backwards to Bashkova's poem, it's also about poets who are tortured, poets who are, and if you go to Rymbu, that's also about, it's about the power of poetry, but it's also about a Pushkin and to a poet. And I think maybe if you keep going back, Vagina, of course, is not
about the war.
It's about war. And so I think there's a combination of their, you know, of poems that are about trauma, but also about the cost of poetry. And that's a recurrent.
What unites this last group of poems.
Right. So
Right.
I think in a way, that's perhaps a way of taking us up to the present moment and saying this is what poets are looking at. All poets are looking all in the present moment of history. And poetry hasn't ended. So history is also, you know, it may be repeating itself, but poetry is continuing to respond to it. And so I don't think so I think that's the sort of sense, is that poetry remains at a cost to the poets, right? It's COVID, but it's also Ovid. Poetry remains alive to what is happening, but it's very, very risky.
So it's 10 minutes to 8, and we'll take the last question.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. So based on this base timeline presented, events across the Soviet Union and farther, could you extrapolate a little bit how the content of the poems will change following this war, let's say, and hopefully the war period after? Because probably there is a shift from the Soviet Union when the Soviet fall, and therefore there will be another shift following this war. Could you extrapolate just based on your analysis and experience of that?
Honestly, I can. No, it's really impossible to extrapolate, right? And it's it would be too самонадеянно, so self-confident to try doing this. Presumptuous, right? To do this, because it's hard to believe that the Soviet Union ended 30 years ago, and we should have extrapolated back then in what would happen in the year 22, and it's really impossible it was impossible to imagine what's going on now. So no, I cannot even I don't even know what will be next year, and so from which position can be extrapolated, or towards which position? I think we are.
Saturated with pain and tragedy and all this suffering, and then there's a lighter period of time in Russia. Therefore, there are a bit lighter points, right? More happiness, more joy, more looking forward to a future, developing country. And right now, there's a state of uncertainty, and therefore it could be going both ways, because saturated with pain once again, or looking forward to a new country that is going to be modernized. I mean, also being presumptuous.
The poetry that we included, it doesn't reflect this dynamic. It has a lot of pain, that's for sure, but it doesn't have a lot of light. I should admit, it's a bittersweet poem. Yeah. It conveys to the reader the sense of the apocalypse. But it says, okay, it's not the last apocalypse that we'll live through. It is optimistic, but in a sad way, I would say.
I guess it's optimistic in that people do leave the closet in the poem, but very quietly.
Do they?
Well, do they? Right.
Okay, you see, we
Well,
we haven't agreed about it yet.
Well, I think it's not absolutely clear. I mean, a quiet apocalypse is what we call the
A quiet apocalypse.
And yeah. But I mean, I think that image in itself, the poem, you know, it makes you think of Sadnik, it makes you think of Mickiewicz. It's an image of Russia. It's, you know, frozen north, but maybe it's also a bit like Munterstein's elegy to Andrei Bieli, where things are frozen in some sort of state. It's not exactly hopeful, but perhaps at some point things will thaw again.
On this cheerful note,
Yeah.
we would like to thank you very much for coming here. Thank you. Yes, thank you.